What if I told you that the human rights you take for granted today, your protection from torture, your right to a fair trial, your freedom from cruel punishment only exist because of unimaginable suffering that happened centuries ago? Between 1626 and 1631, in the German city of Bamberg, 900 people were burned at the stake during what became known as the Bamberg Witch Trials. But before the flames, there was torture. Methods designed not just to punish, but to extract confessions. One device used during this dark period was called the Spanish donkey. Here's the question that should keep you thinking. Have you ever wondered why modern governments have laws forbidding torture? Why the police can't force confessions through pain? Why your constitution protects you from cruel punishment? The answer lies in places like Bamberg. In 1629, the city's chancellor wrote a desperate letter describing how 400 people had been accused, including priests, city officials, and children. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic. This was profitable. And when the world finally confronted what had happened, everything changed. By the end of this video, you'll understand 3 critical truths. First, how torture devices like the Spanish donkey actually worked and why they were used. Second, the shocking economic scheme behind witch accusations that destroyed thousands of lives. And third, how these medieval horrors directly created the human rights protections we rely on today. If you're ready to face uncomfortable historical truths that textbooks skip over, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to reveal connects directly to your freedom today. The Spanish donkey wasn't myth, it was real. A triangular wooden prism mounted on stilts, its sharp edge pointing upward. Historians trace its origins to 12th century France during the Holy Inquisition, and it remained in use through the 1860s. The British added a carved horse's head and tail, transforming punishment into public spectacle. Even Paul Revere documented its use in colonial America. The device forced confessions through unbearable suffering. The British eventually abandoned it not for moral reasons, but because injured soldiers became unfit for battle. Efficiency mattered more than humanity. Now here's what history teachers don't emphasize enough. Witch trials weren't primarily about religious hysteria. They were about money. In Germany, when someone was accused of witchcraft, their property was immediately confiscated, with both church and secular authorities receiving their share. Think about that system for a moment. Every accusation generated revenue, every execution transferred wealth, every trial became a business transaction. Prince Bishop Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim, who presided over the Bamberg trials, made what historians describe as a very handsome profit, seizing the lands of those he sought to destroy. He wasn't just enforcing religious law, he was building an empire on stolen property. The trials themselves cost enormous amounts of money, but authorities simply funded them by confiscating victims' property, making it a profitable racket for local lords. The more people accused, the more wealth transferred. The system incentivized accusations. But here's what reveals the true nature of these trials. Who got accused and who didn't. 80% of witch trial victims were poor, middle-aged or older women. Midwives and healers were particularly suspect. These were society's most vulnerable people, women without powerful family connections, women who owned small plots of land or modest businesses, women who couldn't fight back effectively. One accused woman in Wiesensteig asked her inquisitor a devastating question. Why were rich women never arrested? She knew the answer. Everyone knew the answer, but no one with power would admit it. When wealthy people were occasionally accused what some called dragon witches, they typically had bad reputations for reckless profit-seeking, usury, and even fraud. In other words, they'd made enemies. They'd angered someone with connections, and witchcraft accusations became the weapon to destroy them. But wealth could also provide protection. When Dorothea Flock was accused in Bamberg, her husband escaped to Nuremberg and complained directly to the emperor, who actually intervened. Having powerful connections meant survival. Being poor and friendless meant death. The system was deliberate, the outcomes were predictable, and the profits were substantial. Think about this. If you were a widow in 1620s Germany who inherited your husband's farm, you became a target. If you refused a marriage proposal from a local official, you became vulnerable. If you had land that someone else wanted, you became dangerous. All it took was 3 witnesses, often paid or coerced, to testify they'd seen you at a witches' gathering. Within days, your property was seized. Within weeks, you were tortured until you confessed to whatever they wanted to hear. If this pattern sounds disturbingly familiar, If you're seeing connections to other times when institutions weaponized accusations for profit and power, drop a comment below. Because understanding this history means recognizing when similar patterns emerge today. Understanding why torture was used requires understanding how these trials actually worked. This wasn't random sadism. Torture was meted out in a planned, even bureaucratic way. The torturers wanted confessions, but they quickly realized that information extracted under torture couldn't be trusted. People will say anything to stop the pain, so authorities developed a more calculated approach. Prisoners were kept for months or even years, with torture administered periodically to check whether their confessions remained consistent. They'd torture you today, record your confession, torture you again in 2 weeks. See if you told the same story. If your details changed, they'd torture you more intensely, claiming inconsistency proved you were lying. It was a system designed to be impossible to survive. Torture could extract almost any confession. When suspects proved stubborn, they were often simply tortured to death. The authorities didn't see this as a failure of the system. They saw it as confirmation of guilt. Only a truly evil person would die rather than confess. But here's where it became truly monstrous. Suspects were tortured until they named other people they'd allegedly seen at the Sabbat, causing the trials to escalate and spread. Each victim was forced to accuse others. Each accusation led to new arrests, new confiscations, new torture sessions, new forced accusations. The Witch Commission in Bamberg used torture without restrictions to force confessions and the naming of accomplices. There were no limits, no oversight, no appeals process. Think about the psychological horror of this system. You're being tortured. You know that if you confess, you'll be executed. But if you don't confess, the torture continues indefinitely. And even if you confess, they'll torture you again to force you to name others, your friends, your neighbors, your family members. Every choice leads to death. The only question is how much you'll suffer first, and how many innocent people you'll destroy with you. This was justice in 17th-century Germany. Let's put faces and numbers to this horror, because these weren't abstract statistics. These were real people with names. In the Würzburg trials between 1626 and 1631, 900 people were executed. Among the victims were 43 priests, and even the Prince-Bishop's own nephew. When the system consumed its own administrators, it revealed that no one was truly safe. But the cruelty extended even further. At least 49 children under the age of 12 were executed, many taken directly from the orphanage and school. Children as young as 3 and 4 years old were accused. Students aged 7, 10, 12, 14, and 15 were executed. Read those ages again. 7 years old, 10 years old. Children who should have been learning to read were instead being tortured and killed. The scale of this tragedy is almost incomprehensible. Between 1500 and 1700, the Holy Roman Empire saw 50,000 witch trials. Germany alone witnessed an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 executions, outpacing any other European region. 20,000 people, in a single region, over 2 centuries. These weren't enemy soldiers. They weren't foreign invaders. They were neighbors, community members, healers, teachers, children. The last person executed for witchcraft in Europe was Anna Goldie in Switzerland in 1782. That's not ancient history. That's closer to our time than to the Roman Empire. People alive today had great-great-grandparents who lived in a world where this was still happening. Think about that number, 20,000 to 25,000 executions in Germany alone. Real people, real families destroyed, entire communities torn apart by fear, greed, and unchecked power. If you think remembering these stories matters, if you believe we have a responsibility to never forget what institutions are capable of when unchecked, hit that like button right now. So, why are we talking about medieval torture methods in 2025? Because the horrors of the witch trials directly created the freedoms you have today. When the world finally confronted what had happened in places like Bamberg and Würzburg, everything changed. The last witch execution in Würzburg was Maria Renata Singer von Mossau in 1749, who was beheaded and burned. Around 1767, the Bavarian witch war debate represented one of the largest Enlightenment debates in the German-speaking world. Intellectuals, philosophers, and reformers looked at centuries of torture and execution and asked fundamental questions. Should any government have unlimited power over its citizens? Should confessions extracted through pain be considered valid? Should any human being be subjected to cruel punishment? These debates produced the foundations of modern human rights law. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 5, states, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment." That sentence exists because of what happened in Bamberg. The United States Constitution's Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. The Geneva Conventions establish international standards for treatment of prisoners. Every democratic nation's legal code contains protections against torture. These weren't abstract philosophical achievements. They were direct responses to documented atrocities. The rights you take for granted, the right to remain silent, the right to legal counsel, protection from self-incrimination, the requirement that confessions be voluntary, all emerged from societies saying never again to the horrors of the witch trials. The suffering wasn't meaningless. It changed the world. So here's the question I want you to really think about before you answer in the comments. If you had lived in 1620s Germany and you knew what was happening in those torture chambers, would you have spoken out? Would you have risked becoming the next victim to defend someone accused? Would you have challenged the authorities who profited from the system? It's easy to say yes from the safety of 2025, but the truth is, most people stayed silent. Most people looked away. Most people told themselves it wasn't their problem, or that the victims must have done something to deserve it. Every generation faces this question in different forms. When do you risk everything to expose institutional evil? When do you speak up even when it costs you? The victims of the witch trials, people like Anna Goldie, the 900 executed in Würzburg, the children torn from orphanages, they weren't just statistics. They were human beings with names, families, and dreams. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It forced humanity to build the legal protections we now depend on. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more uncomfortable truths that history books gloss over, subscribe and click the notification bell. I'll see you in the next one.